The Great Chinese Famine. Between 1959 and 1961, China experienced what is widely regarded as the deadliest famine in recorded history. Officially, it was attributed to a combination of natural disasters and poor weather. But historical analyses reveal that political policies played a far greater role. The crisis followed the launch of the Great Leap Forward, an ambitious economic campaign initiated by Chairman Mao Zedong to transform China into a socialist industrial power. Agricultural collectivization, inflated production reports, and the forced establishment of communal farms disrupted traditional farming practices. Local officials, eager to meet unrealistic grain quotas, seized crops for state procurement, leaving rural populations with nothing. Simultaneously, the government continued exporting grain abroad to project economic strength even as millions starved. Estimates of the death toll vary widely due to censorship and record suppression, but modern historians place the number between 30 and 45 million. Entire villages were depopulated. Cases of disease, malnutrition, and in extreme situations, cannibalism were reported. The Great Chinese Famine remains a stark example of how political ideology and administrative failure can magnify natural hardship into a national catastrophe. The Bengal Famine. In 1943, while the Second World War raged across continents, a devastating famine swept through Bengal, then part of British India. Triggered by a combination of wartime inflation, rice shortages, and colonial mismanagement, the famine claimed between 2 and 3 million lives in less than a year. The Japanese occupation of Burma in 1942 had cut off rice imports to India. Simultaneously, British policies diverted food supplies to military use while restricting internal trade to prevent Japanese access in the event of invasion. Crop failures, hoarding, and speculative pricing further inflated costs, placing food beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. Photographs from Calcutta showed skeletal figures collapsing in the streets as the city's wealthy elite continued their daily lives. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill's administration refused to redirect grain shipments, blaming the famine on what it termed Indian overpopulation. Relief efforts began only after massive civilian deaths had already occurred. The Bengal famine remains one of the most debated and condemned humanitarian failures of British colonial rule. The Irish Potato Famine. From 1845 to 1852, Ireland endured a catastrophic famine that reshaped its population and history. The disaster began when a fungal blight known as Phytophthora infestans struck the potato crop, the primary food source for much of the rural poor. Repeated harvest failures devastated communities dependent on subsistence farming. At the time, Ireland was under British governance, and economic policy prioritized grain exports over domestic relief. While Irish peasants starved, food continued to be exported to Britain. The government's response, limited aid, strict workhouse conditions, and reliance on laissez-faire economics, failed to alleviate the crisis. Approximately 1 million people died of starvation and disease, and another 2 million emigrated primarily to the United States and Canada. The population of Ireland declined by nearly 25%. The famine left a deep social and cultural scar, shaping Irish political consciousness and fueling future movements for independence. The North Korean Famine. In the mid-1990s, North Korea suffered a severe famine that the government referred to as the Arduous March. The collapse of the Soviet Union ended crucial trade and aid supplies, while floods and droughts destroyed agricultural infrastructure. Years of centralized planning, mismanagement, and isolationism compounded the crisis. The government's strict control over information makes precise figures uncertain, but estimates suggest between 600,000 and 2 million people died between 1994 and 1998. Food rations were drastically reduced, and reports emerged of widespread starvation, disease, and displacement. Entire families abandoned their homes to search for food, with many crossing into China illegally in desperate attempts to survive. Despite international aid reaching the country, distribution was often selective, favoring political and military elites. The famine fundamentally weakened North Korea's agricultural system and reshaped its internal society, deepening mistrust between the government and its citizens. The Ethiopian Famine. In 1983, Ethiopia began to experience one of the most devastating famines of the late 20th century. Triggered by drought, civil conflict, and economic instability, the famine lasted until 1985 and resulted in the deaths of approximately 1 million people. The ruling Derg regime's policies worsened the crisis through forced resettlement and agricultural collectivization. The government prioritized military spending over relief and blocked access to rebel-controlled areas, preventing humanitarian assistance from reaching those most in need. Entire communities in the northern provinces of Tigray and Wollo were displaced or perished. The famine gained global attention through international media coverage, particularly after the BBC broadcast harrowing footage from the affected regions. In response, a massive global fundraising effort emerged, leading to the Live Aid concert in 1985. Despite these efforts, recovery was slow, and political instability continued to hinder the nation's food security for years afterward. The Soviet Famine, Holodomor. Between 1932 and 1933, under Joseph Stalin's rule, the Soviet Union experienced a devastating famine concentrated in Ukraine, known today as the Holodomor. The famine resulted from forced collectivization, aggressive grain requisition quotas, and punitive policies against perceived kulak resistance. As state agents confiscated grain and livestock to meet unrealistic export goals, rural populations were left without sustenance. Internal passports were introduced to prevent peasants from leaving their villages, effectively trapping them amid starvation. The Soviet government publicly denied the famine's existence, while secret police monitored those who spoke about it. Estimates of the death toll range between 3 and 7 million. Many scholars and governments now recognize the Holodomor as a deliberate act of genocide intended to suppress Ukrainian nationalism and resistance to Soviet control. For decades, the event remained censored within the USSR, only officially acknowledged in the late 1980s during the era of glasnost and reform. The Vietnamese Famine of 1945. In 1945, amid the chaos of World War II, northern Vietnam, then under Japanese occupation and French colonial administration, suffered a famine that killed up to 2 million people. The disaster resulted from a combination of poor harvests, requisitioning of rice for Japanese military use, and the destruction of transport networks by Allied bombing. While rice stocks existed elsewhere in the country, military blockades and administrative breakdowns prevented their distribution. Eyewitnesses described scenes of mass starvation along roads and in villages, as families abandoned their homes in search of food. Many perished along the way. The famine deeply influenced Vietnam's political future. The widespread suffering and resentment against colonial powers contributed to the rise of the Viet Minh, who promised land reform and food security. Within months, this movement would lead to the August Revolution and the declaration of Vietnamese independence.